B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, October 2nd, 2020. The Trump White House and campaign reeling from a trifecta of October surprises. And I just told you it's only October 2nd. So I have the benefit here of being 3 hours ahead of East Coast time, 3 hours behind. And last night, I stayed up late to watch the breaking news of first the announcement that Hope Hicks, a White House advisor who is very close to Donald Trump, we have pictures of them holding hands, that she tested positive for coronavirus, the China virus, the Wuhan flu. And Trump called in to Sean Hannity to report that he and Melania had been tested. They were awaiting the results. And then just between 1 and 2 a.m. Eastern Time, Trump tweeted news that he and First Lady Melania, now Trump, have both tested positive for the virus. And he said, we're going to beat this together. That appears to be the only thing they'll do together. She doesn't even sleep at the White House every night. And so just as I was getting ready to come into the studio here to record Friday's podcast, the news broke that White House officials have announced that Trump has helicoptered to the Walter Reed National Military Center. Out of an abundance of caution, we're told. They say he has a low-grade fever, a cough, nasal congestion, and those are symptoms of the virus. So he spent the day working and making calls, and watching TV, I'm sure. And he plans to continue watching TV from the hospital, I'm sure. They have an executive office suite set up for the president's use, including a residence and office space. And they're saying that he's not seriously ill, but that because of his age and other risk factors, like that big belly of his, that they are taking these precautions. So it's anybody's guess how serious a case he will have. And I know that there are some people who have these conflicting feelings. And let me acknowledge my own. I was raised a Christian, a Catholic. I define myself as agnostic these days. But I operate, more or less under the teachings of Jesus. And in general, I avoid gloating or harboring bad wishes against people who I don't like or even people I detest. My general feeling is that out of respect for humanity, I don't go into that dark space. But Trump is a special case. He has so much contempt for humanity. And he has displayed this public contempt for the coronavirus and for observing the protocols and restrictions, face masks, and social distancing that the little people like you and me have been instructed to follow. He's too cool. He's too strong. He considers himself immune. And so I will absolve you of any guilt for feelings of, wishing that Trump doesn't survive this. Because as screenplays go, it would be what appears to be the best available exit for the Trump virus. So I'll leave it at that, but I wanted to acknowledge that it's hard to go high, as Michelle Obama would say, when the guy who has delivered so many low blows is felled by this disease that he just the night before in Duluth, Minnesota, declared is just about behind us. So we'll get to more about Trump and the details of this stunning development. But to me, the most unusual aspect of this is that so many people, particularly on the left, don't believe this claim from Trump. So just before midnight, my time last night, I got the first listener email. This is from Tao Lin. He said, I'm sure by now you've heard the news that the Trumps have tested positive. I believe this is the ultimate distraction put out by the Trump campaign. He will make a timely and miraculous total recovery, showing everyone that he has divine assistance and it's God's will that he gets reelected. And his recovery will also demonstrate that the virus is indeed a liberal hoax. So I put up a simple statement on Facebook. The October surprise is Rona karma. And right away, the first response. No, the first one was funny. It was Carl Howard saying, Corona karma, enjoy it better with shawarma. That was clever. Then Dave Isley posted, October surprise. He's faking it to get out of last debate. He'll claim recovery due to his superior genes and then move in on the sympathy vote for the win. If he loses the vote, he can fake a relapse and death to avoid prosecution. All right, then Larry Carlin posted the lyrics to Instant Karma by John Lennon. Ben Birch, our longtime ally, who has been the guy who archived so many progressive radio shows, he responded, I do not believe. This may be a huge ploy for sympathy while early votes are being cast. Okay. And then my friend Nancy Walton out in Montana. He lies about everything, all caps for everything. Why should we believe he's not just telling another one now? The fact that he tweeted about it, almost like he was celebrating being in the spotlight, with the intent of diverting media attention from his disastrous debate performance, perhaps, indicates that he's just pulling another con. I can see him using the 25th Amendment, turning over his job to Pence so he can evoke sympathy in a desperate attempt to boost his ratings and desperately try to get more votes. And then say maybe a week before the election he recovers, it's like a miracle, and everyone is only focused on how he's doing, not about the debates. I'll be shocked if this isn't just some new half-baked con job. All right. Well, Nancy, Ben, Dave, you're not alone. Tao, according to the New York Times, which cites Data Miner, a social media monitoring service, the tweets questioning Trump's announcement peaked at 5 per minute on Friday morning. Now, this speaks more to the credibility of Trump, which he has personally shredded thousands of times. And I'm sympathetic to the argument that's being advanced here. I don't share it, actually, but I understand how you get there. And Frank Bruni, opinionator in the New York Times, writes a quickie op-ed. It's a measure of the cynicism that has infected American politics, and yes, me, that among my initial reactions to the news that Trump has tested positive for the virus was, are we sure? Can we trust that? A man who so frequently and flamboyantly plays the victim and who's been prophylactically compiling ways to explain away or dispute a projected election loss to Biden is now being forced off the campaign trail, which will be a monster of an excuse. And Bruni continues, I couldn't help thinking, too, about karma, and I immediately felt and still feel petty for that. Trump has spent much of the past 6 months, during which more than 200,000 Americans died of causes related to the virus, downplaying the pandemic, flinging out false reassurances, and refusing to abide by the very public health guidelines that officials in his own government were fervently promoting. And on the next page, he writes, the most obvious is that the coronavirus has not gone away. There is no guarantee, contrary to the president's sunny prophecies, that it's going away anytime soon. Which brings up another moral. There's a real risk in being cavalier. The president is now the embodiment of that. The First Lady, too, also Hope Hicks, one of his closest advisors, and who knows how many others in his immediate circle. So it is fascinating to see this develop and to see what is, I promote skepticism all the time. I'm often alone in offering skeptical views of things like, Novichok poisonings or 9/11. So I welcome people who are skeptical, but I really don't think that Trump could orchestrate this kind of fiction and involve Melania, who often refuses to even hold his hand, and other people we'll get to who have tested positive, who've been around Trump in recent days. But they clearly scrambled for about 24 hours because coming back from Duluth Wednesday night, Hope Hicks was coughing and displaying symptoms, so they shoved her in a compartment in the back of Air Force One, and she was required to leave by the rear doors. Thursday morning, we are told that Trump was already in Marine One, and the door was closed, and the blades were spinning, and the chopper was lifting off when Hope Hicks disclosed to the Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, that she had tested positive. So Trump continued on his schedule. He went to a fundraiser with Fat Cats at his golf course in Bedminster, New Jersey. About 100 people there who are described as freaking out now. He was described as tired, both on Wednesday night when he fell asleep on the plane ride back to Washington and on Thursday on the return to the White House from New Jersey. And so the cover-up didn't last very long because apparently other people working in the White House leaked it, and that's what forced Trump to go public on Thursday evening. So there is a lot we don't know, and I want to acknowledge that. We don't know how he got it. And Peter Baker at the New York Times made the right suggestion. It's possible that he infected Hope Hicks rather than she infecting him. And he's been so cavalier and careless, believing that because he's frequently tested that he lives in a virus-free bubble. But the testing doesn't mean that you stay negative. And as we know, you can be exposed to somebody, not develop symptoms or respond positively to a test, and the tests are flaky to begin with. And so we see the attitude of the president as he's tried to spin this thing away, try to promote and pump out blue sky, that his sheer determination and will was going to kill this virus. Oh, and he had to clear his schedule today. He won't be going to Wisconsin for mob rallies, a state that is riding through a spike in reported cases right now. He was supposed to go to Florida today for a mob rally, and that's off. And Mike Pence had to stand in for him on a phone call with seniors about their vulnerability to COVID-19. So, I just imagine you put Trump in Walter Reed. He's probably demanded 5 screens in his hospital room so that he can watch and see himself on TV and then tweet away at the media that doesn't like him and treats him so unfairly. So Joe Biden and his wife Jill, they have tested negative as recently as today. And they're sending thoughts and prayers, just like it was a mass shooting. Biden tweeted Jill and I send our thoughts to President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump for a swift recovery. We will continue to pray for the health and safety of the president and his family. Oh, and Vladimir Putin, we are told, sent a telegram. Is that still a thing? I thought the only thing you could do that approximates telegrams these days is to do wire transfers of money for people who don't have bank accounts. Did Putin offer him a taste of the Russian Sputnik V vaccine? Well, we don't know. Okay, so the people who've been around Trump who have suddenly tested positive include the president of Notre Dame University, the Reverend John I. Jenkins. He was at the White House for the debut of Judge Amy Coney Barrett for her nomination to the Supreme Court. And Father Jenkins didn't wear a mask there. He was hanging out with a bunch of other people who didn't have a mask. Senator Mike Lee, the Republican of Utah, he's tested positive. He was at the Barrett event. And Ronna McDaniel, whose middle name is Romney, but she kind of buries that these days. I believe she was also at the event with Amy Coney Barrett, and she announced that she has tested positive today. But Barrett herself, she tested positive sometime over the summer. They're not giving us an exact time citation, but the announcement is that she has since recovered. There are no details on how severe her infection was and how long it took her to recover. And because of these COVID developments in the White House and affecting Mike Lee, the senator from Utah, Chuck Schumer and Dianne Feinstein went public urging a delay in the Supreme Court nomination process to give Mike Lee enough time to recover or to, be cleared. And they said, it's premature for Chairman Lindsey Graham to commit to a hearing schedule when we do not know the full extent of potential exposure stemming from the president's infection and before the White House puts in place a contact tracing plan to prevent further spread of the disease. The unfortunate news about the infection of our colleague Mike Lee makes it even more clear that health and safety must guide the schedule for all Senate activities, including hearings, and it's already been ruled out to do Zoom hearings for the Supreme Court confirmation. So that's an interesting new effort to delay the proceedings, one that certainly wasn't available when we talked about, using stalling tactics under parliamentary procedure. But I doubt if that will affect either Mitch McConnell or Lindsey Graham. And The Guardian has retraced Trump's steps over this past week. We know Tuesday night was the debate in Cleveland. That was a beautiful thing. Now, he appeared to be very healthy and able to mount his aggressive bullying of Joe Biden and the moderator, Chris Wallace, who's still taking a pummeling. So Wednesday was a private donor event in Minneapolis, no mask. A rally in Duluth, very few masks on anybody. In Duluth, he emerged from Air Force One, waved at his supporters. He threw some MAGA hats into the audience. Then he went into his usual stump speech. But he wrapped up early. He often does as long as 2 hours in these mob rallies, but this was a quickie, 45 minutes. So behind the scenes, Hope Hicks, who had accompanied Trump on this trip to Minnesota, said she was feeling unwell, a cough, headache. She was isolated in a separate part of Air Force One, and as I mentioned, exited through the rear. And then this is when we know that a cover-up began. Didn't last that long. But Thursday morning, Hicks tests positive. The news is described as going through the White House like a bomb blast. And they're saying, as I mentioned earlier, that Trump was already lifting off in Marine One on his way to the fundraiser in New Jersey. So several aides who'd been in close proximity to Hicks were due to go with Trump on the New Jersey trip, but they stayed back. At the golf club, Trump made a speech, mingled with supporters. As usual, no mask. And then he took his test later on Thursday, and apparently the results came back sometime near midnight. So there's a lot of speculation about whether Trump will go back on hydroxychloroquine. He said he took a course of that. It was back in May, just to try it out, just to build up his immunities. And I wouldn't blame him for trying it. He can be a guinea pig. And it's possible it may help him, because it does appear that when it's prescribed for people early in an infection, it does appear to have some benefits as a treatment. I know it's because he promoted it. The FDA withdrew its emergency approval of it, but I remain just kind of neutral on hydroxychloroquine. And then what about the antibody treatments, including the convalescent antibodies that he was touting in that news conference where he forced medical officials to endorse his comments right before the Republican online convention back in August? So he clearly will try to parlay this into some advantage for Trump. It's the only gear on his gear shift, and it's going to be fascinating, with just over 30 days remaining until the crucial November 3rd election. And as a result of Trump's declaration, whether you believe it or not, Nancy Pelosi expressed fresh optimism today that a bipartisan deal for a broad coronavirus package could emerge out of her talks with former foreclosure king Steve Mnuchin. This kind of changes the dynamic, Nancy said, because here they see the reality of what we have been saying all along. This is a vicious virus. She said that she and Mnuchin are still pretty far apart, but the gap has been closing in the negotiations. And she seemed positive. She said, we'll find our common ground. We're legislators. We get the job done. So that's just one major setback for the family Trump that occurred on the 1st of October. Surprise. The other is that Melania Trump was secretly recorded by her former friend Stephanie Winston Wolkoff. Wolkoff came forward with her book, Melania and Me, The Rise and Fall of My Friendship with the First Lady. And she, of course, was the wedding planner from New York who was hired to manage the 2017 inauguration. And once she knew she was under the bus from her former friend, Melania, she wrote her book, and now she has released this tape, which not only shows that Melania has a really, really potty mouth, dropping F-bombs faster than Who Shot Bob, and also, she bitches a lot about the burdens of being First Lady.
They say I'm complicit. I'm the same like him. I support him. I don't say enough. I don't do enough.
No,
where I am, I'm working like a my Christmas stuff that, who gives a about Christmas stuff and decoration, but I need to do it, right?
Yeah, but imagine 100%. You have no choice.
And then I do it, and I say that I'm working on Christmas, planning for the Christmas, and they said, oh, what about the children, that they were separated? Give me a break. Where they were saying anything when Obama did that?
I know.
I cannot go. I was trying to get the kid reunited with the mom. I didn't have a chance. Needs to go through the process and through the...
But here's my thing. Hear what you just said. But instead of that, if your messaging, you were so loved.
They would not do the story. We put it out. They would not do the story.
I'm telling
you, would not believe it. They would not do it because they would not do the story because they are against us because they're liberal media. Yeah, if I go to Fox, they will do the story. I don't want to go to Fox.
It's so interesting. I mean, there's...
That's enough of you. That is really funny. That she wanted to do this heartwarming story about how she tried to help a kid who'd been separated from his mom at the border. I guess that's what she's referring to. But that they put it out, would pick up on it, and that she doesn't want to be on Fox. That's too easy. So it is fascinating for her to say, who gives a fuck about Christmas after her alleged husband deal about putting the Christ back in Christmas and saying Merry Christmas. This is quite embarrassing. And it hit on the 1st of October, so it qualifies as an October surprise. And the third item in this trifecta is a story under the byline of Jane Mayer, a very credible reporter, who has dug into the departure of one Kimberly Guilfoyle from Fox News, where she resided for, over 10 years. And she had been hired by Roger Ailes. Embarrassed about Kimberly Guilfoyle, who's now Don Trump Jr.'s girlfriend. The two of them just $4 million crib out on Long Island. Anyway, she was previously married to the mayor of San Francisco, Gavin Newsom, who's now the governor of California. And after they divorced, she went to New York. She got the gig on Fox, where she has done a lot of right-wing talking points with a vengeance. And, of course, we were screamed at her if we watched the Republican online convention back in August, because she gave a speech where she was just shouting at the top of her lungs. So what Jane Mayer has revealed is that Guilfoyle's departure from Fox News was not voluntary. And after she left, she was hired almost immediately at a high salary by the Trump campaign. But a former assistant to Guilfoyle, whose name we don't know, filed a complaint with Fox. It was 42 pages long. And she alleged that Guilfoyle, her direct supervisor, subjected her frequently to degrading, abusive, and sexually inappropriate behavior. Among other things, she said she was frequently required to work at Guilfoyle's New York apartment while the Fox host displayed herself naked and was shown photographs of the genitalia of men with whom Guilfoyle had had sexual relations. The draft complaint also alleged that Guilfoyle spoke incessantly and luridly about her sex life, and on one occasion demanded a massage of her bare thighs. Other times, Guilfoyle told her to submit to a Fox employee's demands for sexual favors, encouraged her to sleep with wealthy and powerful men, asked her to critique her naked body, demanded that she share a room with her on business trips, required her to sleep over at her apartment, and exposed herself to the younger assistant. And then, when the 42-page report landed at a law firm hired by Fox to investigate, Guilfoyle tried to hush her up. She didn't use Michael Cohen or the publisher of the National Enquirer. She just offered hush money. Amounts were dropped up to $1 million or a percentage of Guilfoyle's future income. But the young woman did not acquiesce. And now we know more of the story. There is other news today in Louisville. They have released the audio recordings of the grand jury investigation into the police killing of Breonna Taylor back in March. It's about 15 hours long, so reporters are still reviewing the contents. The early findings show that there are no statements or recommendations from prosecutors about which charges they think should be brought against the 3 police officers. The Attorney General of Florida, Daniel Cameron, has said that his jurors were told that the 2 officers who shot Ms. Taylor were justified And ultimately, the jurors indicted the third officer last week on 3 charges of endangering Taylor's neighbors by firing into their home during the raid on the apartment. And Cameron's on the defensive. He has insisted that the 12 jurors were given all the evidence and were free to pursue additional charges. But it's known that the grand jurors are often led by the nose because they've never done this before. They don't know what the ground rules and parameters are. So, one portion of the recording is the testimony of Detective Miles Cosgrove. He's the one who the FBI identifies as the shooter whose bullet killed Breonna Taylor. He described a disorienting scene of flashing lights as officers broke down the door and seemed to suggest uncertainty about exactly what happened. He's quoted as saying in the interview, "I know that I have fired. I've just sensed that I have fired. But it's like a surreal thing. If you told me I didn't do something at that time, I'd believe you. If you told me I did do something, I'd probably believe you too." This sounds like a really credible witness. So Cosgrove says when he got to the doorway, after, breaking down the door with a battering ram, he was overwhelmed with bright flashes and darkness. What I describe as a movie reel that's doing that ticking wherever you see white and black, white and black. Cosgrove said he also saw a shadow of a person, larger than normal human shadow. Now, how reliable is he as an eyewitness to the shooting that he conducted? This is just really bizarre. Another segment of the recordings shows that grand jurors did ask questions about Breonna's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker. Had he been named in the search warrant? The answer was no. What did officers see exactly when the apartment door opened? Did the officers executing the warrant, were they aware that the police had already found Breonna's former boyfriend, the drug dealer Jamarcus Glover, who was the target of the investigation to begin with? And we know that Glover was in custody by the time of the midnight raid at Breonna's apartment. So these are important questions, and it shows that some of the jurors were skeptical about what they were being shown. One asked to see timestamps on the video. Another asked why they had not seen the room where the gun was found. So despite the limited indictments that were returned, it appears that the jurors did try to do their job. Grand jurors heard at least 2 police officers say that the group knocked and announced their presence several times before they knocked down the door. Cosgrove, the officer who shot Taylor, said that they were outside knocking for 90 seconds. The volume escalated from gentle knocking to forceful pounding to pounding while yelling police. And this is not evidence of the grand jury, but the New York Times interviewed all of the neighbors, and 11 of 12 said they never heard the police identify themselves, and the 12th neighbor said that he heard the group say police only one time. So we'll find out more and update the reporting as there is more coverage of this grand jury recording. Now on to election issues in the state of Texas. Governor Greg Abbott yesterday abruptly announced that he was reducing, by an order of the governor, the number of drop boxes for mail-in ballots. Now, I've seen this play before. Back in Ohio in 2016, I was there in Cincinnati for my mom's funeral, and I observed the early voting attempts after the Republican Attorney General of Ohio, John Husted, had ordered that early voting could only occur at 1 polling place per county. Well, that is the same draconian rule that Abbott has imposed. You can only have 1 drop-off location for mail-in ballots per county. Now, some Texas counties are huge and sprawling. Like Harris County, where Houston is, they currently have 34 drop locations. I take that back. They had 12. And there are a total of 254 counties. Some of them are 6,000 square miles. So this is a clear voter suppression tactic. But I continue to ask, why do the Republicans who are trying to throttle back voter participation, whether it's by mail or using these drop boxes, why do they believe that these efforts to repress that vote will benefit Republicans and only hurt Democrats? I don't get that. And maybe I'm thick, and if you have a better explanation, would you email peter@peterbcollins.com? I'd be much obliged. Well, the Bill Barr law firm called the Justice Department is collaborating with the FBI to set up a command center at FBI headquarters around the election to deal with any disturbances or other problems with voting that may occur after being provoked by Donald Trump. You know, the Proud Boys standing by, not standing down. So I've linked to the article in the Washington Post because it's an okay report, but it is truly sanitized. And while it infers that Trump is the source of potential violence, it's kind of a sanitized look at in a more process-oriented piece. Here's a quote. Those at the command center, including civil rights and national security officials, will monitor news accounts of any high-profile incidents as well as reports from U.S. attorneys or others in the field and determine how the federal government should respond. And they note that plans to use the command center preceded Trump's threats in the Cleveland debate on Tuesday. But for an unvarnished look at the gathering storm of federal forces across the country, we turn to the World Socialist website and a great article about what's called Operation Legend. And it was named after a 4-year-old boy, Legend Taliaferro, who was killed in Kansas City by a stray bullet back in June. And that is the happy face that obscures the deployment of federal personnel and money to Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Albuquerque, Memphis, and Kansas City, MO. And as this report indicates, for example, in Cleveland, the Justice Department's Bureau of Justice Assistance has dished up $1 million to Operation Legend activities, and the Community-Oriented Policing Service Office made $10 million available to the Cleveland Police Department to fund the hiring of 30 officers, 5 state troopers, and 4 adult parole authority officers. In Detroit, they got $2.4 million for hiring 15 officers and $1.4 million for overhead. And in Wisconsin, police departments were given a total of $10.2 million to hire 29 new officers and $1.9 million for expenses. So this is a big operation. We don't know exactly what they are up to. Many of these are the Democrat cities that Trump believes are out of control and need a good dose of federal law and order. And the article shares with us that Operation Legend is a significant component of the scheming, but it is only part of a broader move to militarize and federalize the police launched last December under Operation Relentless Pursuit. And that has doled out $71 million in grants to cities for the purpose of purchasing new equipment and technology. Probably the Palantir software that captures and stores data on just about everybody and everything they do. Truth Out has a good report under the byline of Ella Fassler that progressive groups are mobilizing to confront voter intimidation And this is a coalition of the Women's March, Working Families Party, Movement for Black Lives Electoral Justice Project, United We Dream, and other organizations mobilizing election defenders. So far, more than 6,000 people across the country have signed up for the role. Trump is operating from a place of weakness, not strength, they say, and the single best way to avoid a contested election is for voters to repudiate him at the polls by an overwhelming margin. And if Trump still tries to steal the election, you can expect us to raise our voices like never before. So I'm pleased to see that it won't just be right-wing nuts who are responding to dog whistles from their fearless leader who will be out at the polls on Election Day. I've linked to an interesting report published by Vice News a day or two ago, and they've analyzed the summer protests. One important takeaway, out of 10,600 demonstrations across the country this summer, 96% were peaceful. 96%. But Trump, Fox News, One America News, they have persuaded the cult followers that there's massive crime in every city. It's every night. All the protesters are thugs and looters and Antifa. But the report also reveals that there have been 70 total gun incidents at these protests. 22 people have died at Black Lives Matter protests. Shootings that resulted in non-fatal injuries, 14. The number of times that guns were brandished in a threatening manner, 26. Incidents where Black Lives Matter protesters were threatened, shot, or killed is 33. And the incidents where counter-protesters were threatened, shot at, or killed is 12. So 33 to 12 is the ratio. And that's the ratio of people affiliated with police reform being killed, 33, and the Trump allies at 12. So it does mean that the police reform movement is not full of angels. I think some of the incidents, you could say, were justified self-defense by the pro-BLM protesters. But I am saddened that there has been that level of violence coming from the protesters who I believe are on the right side of this issue. Now, while Trump is watching a lot of TV over there at Walter Reed, I'm sure that Fox is going to play up the new caravan that is surging toward our border. They're hundreds and hundreds of miles away, but desperate people from Honduras have crossed over into the newly reopened border of Guatemala, and they're not applying for asylum under the ridiculous rules that Trump has put in place to block people applying for asylum. They are marching forward as a group, described as a couple of hundred people at this point. And the picture that I see from the AP is of moms and families. There are a handful of guys in the photo. John Brennan, former CIA director, has a new book out. Doesn't everybody there are too many of these books out. But John Brennan is a guy who I single out as one of the liars of the Obama administration. And he is admitting that in the research and drafting of what was called the Intelligence Community Assessment that was published on January 6th of 2017, which said that we assess that Russia meddled in the 2016 election. We assess, we believe, we assess, we believe. And at the time, it was described that this was the product of 17 intelligence agencies. We know it was really 3, the CIA, the NSA, and the Director of National Intelligence Office. And really, it was just the 2 because the DNI is supposed to be more of a coordinating function. So what Brennan has admitted is that 2 of his top officials who were on the team reviewing all this intelligence came to him and said that we don't have high confidence in the report with all these weasel words and these assessments and this phony attack on Abby Martin's RT show that had been off the air for 2 years. And after Mike Rogers, who at the time was head of the NSA, downgraded his level of confidence to medium, I think moderate is the word they use, Brennan insisted on keeping the CIA's assessment at the top level. He said, when these two people came and talked to me about it, I listened to them because I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what their concerns were, and I encouraged them to talk to the authors of the assessment and determine if the judgment should stay at high confidence or medium confidence. And this is important because we know that the way this whole thing was described, it amplified extremely the extent to which all of these agencies collaborated to determine the dastardly deeds of Russia. And so Brennan overruled them because he said, I knew more than they did. I was briefed on things they didn't know about, including the alleged mole that we had in the Kremlin. And that's still a story that's very hard to buy. But Brennan also responded to the release of a document by the new Director of National Intelligence, a highly partisan Republican from Texas, John Ratcliffe. And he released a letter this week with 3 quotes in it related to allegations that Hillary Clinton had approved a plan for her 2016 campaign to stir up a scandal against Trump by tying him to Russian hackers. And while the way this was presented by Ratcliffe lacked credibility, I am open to the allegation that's being made here. I think it's possible that occurred. But get this. Brennan sharply criticized Ratcliffe's disturbing release of selective information. Jesus Christ. What did he do in 2016 and 2017? Precisely that. I've linked to a great report by Ben Norton at the Gray Zone Project today. And in it, we learn that there is a fake left-wing news website called Peace Data. And it is now being linked to Russian propaganda and influence operations. And it's really a joke. Because Peace Data was completely unknown before it was exposed by the FBI as the heart of a supposed Russian disinformation scheme. Their website had next to no following. They had 197 likes on Facebook. And Peace Data published articles from left-wing websites, including the Gray Zone and Truth Out. And this is being described as suspicious meddling from outside the United States, but just like the exaggerations from 2016, only 5% of Peace Data's total articles were about the U.S. election, around 35 posts. Now, some people will suspect, well, that's how they do it. They put a lot of benign stuff in there, and then they bury the actual poison that they want you to consume. And it's quite an expose. It runs over 30 pages printed out. But I encourage you to peruse it because, like the report yesterday, these claims of Russian meddling, they come without evidence, and this appears to be an effort to smear independent, left-leaning media outlets. Well, the extradition hearing for Julian Assange to be brought to the United States to face trial under the Espionage Act has concluded. There will be written final arguments presented, and then Judge Vanessa Baraitser has said that she will announce her decision about whether or not to allow Trump to be sent to the United States on January 4th of next year. And Consortium News reports that one of the final witnesses, again, testimony read into the record, was Professor Michael Tiger of Duke Law. And he explained how the treatment of Assange is similar to what happened with Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers, and how the efforts to wiretap Ellsberg, to break into the office of his psychiatrist, are similar to the incredibly invasive surveillance that was visited on Julian Assange at the Embassy of Ecuador in London. And this led Dan Ellsberg to write an email to Joe Lauria at Consortium News. This is essentially the same information that ended my case and confronted Nixon with impeachment, leading to his resignation. In other words, Julian may miraculously walk free on the basis of this, just as I did. Well, I'd love for you to be right, Dan. But it's pretty clear how biased Vanessa Baratzer is. And Joe Lauria sums it up that there are 3 areas that Baratzer can consider in approving or rejecting the the extradition request. Whether there was political motivation, whether there has been abuse of power, and whether Assange would face cruel and inhumane treatment if extradited. Now, I'm biased in favor of Assange, but as I look at that, it's very clear. He should be released. He should not be extradited. And John Pilger published a piece, let me quote, and thanks to Carl Howard for pulling this out for me. The prevailing atmosphere has been shocking at this hearing. I say that without hesitation. I've sat in many courts, seldom known such a corruption of due process. This is due revenge. Putting aside the ritual associated with British justice, at times it has been evocative of a Stalinist show trial. One difference is that in the show trials, the defendant stood in the court proper. In the Assange trial, the defendant was caged behind thick glass and had to crawl on his knees to a slit in the glass overseen by a guard to make contact with his lawyers. His message, whispered barely audibly through face masks, was then passed by post-it the length of the court to where his barristers were arguing the case against his extradition to an American hellhole. And I think you know how much I admire Ai Weiwei. If you haven't heard it, go to the search window at peterbcollins.com and just enter Ai Weiwei for my interview with him about a year ago. And he went public. I consider him to be a worldwide activist and a citizen of the world. And outside the Old Bailey, he set up a banner, staging a silent protest on Monday. And he said that Assange truly represents a core value of why we are free, because we have freedom of the press. Assange is prepared to fight, but this is not fair to him. Free him. Let him be a free man. Ed Snowden has been ordered by a U.S. federal court, the Rocket Docket Eastern District of Virginia, to cough up $5.2 million in book royalties because he didn't follow the CIA approval process to publish his book. And this is a sick joke, but and I don't know that they will ever collect it. It may be part of some sort of a deal if he is ever permitted to return to the United States. And I've been holding this story for, I think, almost a week now, but I was struck by this buried in the New York Times. Last week, U.S. Special Ops Forces killed a top al-Qaeda leader in northwest Syria in an unusual drone strike. Oh, it was 2 weeks before the article was published, so it's roughly 3 weeks ago. And they used a secretive weapon, the so-called Ninja Hellfire missile, on which the explosive warhead is replaced by long blades to crush or slice its victim while minimizing risks to any civilians nearby. Now, I haven't actually seen a picture or a video of this, but in my imagination, the R-9X missile with its Ninja warhead is some sort of weird concoction based on Edward Scissorhands. And I know that whether you hit somebody with 20 pounds of C4 explosives or any other munition, that a death by a drone strike is a death by a drone strike. But the idea that we would slice somebody into itty-bitsy pieces seems really excessive. And the idea that it prevents damage or injury or death to nearby people, I don't know about that. But that's their marketing claim. Here's today's COVID-19 update from the Peter B. Collins podcast. Worldwide, we now have reported, this is the U.S. figures. I don't have worldwide in front of me today. The U.S. figure is 7.3 million cases with 207,000 deaths, 207,699, the official number. On October 1st, there were 46,000 new cases. That's before the White House super spreader numbers were announced, and there were 847 deaths. And what we are seeing is the virus has picked up speed again. As October began, there are 22 states where new cases are high and staying high, while there are 21 states where new cases were lower and staying low. And Wisconsin is one that is a hot spot. They have more than 15 new cases per 100,000 people over the past week. That's a daily average. We are in crisis right now, said the Secretary of the State Health Department. Our healthcare system is feeling the strain. And case numbers remain persistently high across much of the country as reports of new infections surge in the upper Midwest and parts of the West. North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Utah, and Montana are reporting that they are at the center of this current surge. And this is only anecdotal. But you've heard Trump and others say that young people don't have anything to fear from the coronavirus. And the other day, I shared the story of the beefy football player, a 20-year-old, it's called California University in Pennsylvania. He died in late August of COVID. And on Monday, a 19-year-old student at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, died from contracting COVID-19. He was described as being in tremendous shape. He tested positive for the virus. He developed flu-like symptoms. He went home. After quarantining for 10 days and being cleared by his doctor, he returned to school and then began suffering serious neurological problems. So it is a nasty virus. And while it's true that the death rate is not as high as many people had projected, it does kill people. And I know there are plenty of people who have COVID fatigue. They just want it to be over. And perhaps voters of every stripe will respond to the Trump infection. And he doesn't have an asymptomatic case. He has developed symptoms. And this may be a national learning moment. Yesterday in the House, they passed a resolution condemning QAnon, but 18 Republicans wouldn't vote for it. And this came after Tom Malinowski, the Democratic congressman from New Jersey, the former head of Human Rights Watch in this country, was targeted by QAnon, received death threats, and he sponsored this resolution. But 17 Republicans essentially voted with QAnon. And, I don't know everything about QAnon, but I don't think that supporting them is in the interests of any politician. Justin Amash, the independent from Michigan, voted against it. Andy Harris of Maryland, a Republican, voted present. And here's the rest of the list. Jody Arrington, Michael Burgess, Bill Flores, Brian Babin of Texas, Rob Bishop of Utah, Mo Brooks of Alabama, Buddy Carter and Drew Ferguson of Georgia, Warren Davidson of Ohio, Jeff Duncan and Ralph Norman of South Carolina, Paul Gosar of Arizona, Mike Kelly, Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, Tom Tiffany of Wisconsin, Daniel Webster of Florida, and Steve King of Iowa, who never met a racist he didn't like. A couple more items here as I wrap up today. At Mint Press News, Leonardo Flores reports on the glaring omissions from a report from the UN Human Rights Council. And without sending anybody to Venezuela, they produced a report that focuses on the point of view of the Juan Guaido-led opposition. And as this report indicates, I've linked to it, you can read it for yourselves, they left out a number of cases where violence was perpetrated by the anti-Maduro activists, including one case related to Orlando Figuera, a young black man who was burned alive by anti-government protesters. It is arguably the most infamous violation of human rights in Venezuela in recent years. And while victims like Figuera are ignored, well, the report whitewashes political actors linked to violence by presenting them as victims. So I think it's worth reading as we continue to monitor the U.S. efforts, bipartisan in nature, including Human Rights Watch that Tom Malinowski used to run. They support regime change in Venezuela. I don't know how that is in their purview, but that's where it is. Also, I want to commend Mint Press News because Miko Peled, he is the Israeli son of an Israeli general. He's been interviewed on this podcast, and he reports here on something that I had not heard of. There are close to 200 organizations that are trying to marginalize the Anti-Defamation League in an effort called Drop the ADL. These 200 organizations have signed on to an important initiative calling to end all collaboration with the ADL. And it positions itself as a human rights group. And just this week, the ADL came out criticizing the Proud Boys as a hate group. But the ADL operates as a clear advocate for the government of the State of Israel, the far-right Netanyahu Zionist regime. Just last December, the ADL came out enthusiastically for Donald Trump. Let me take that back. This was December of 2017. The statement congratulates him for planning to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. Now, that is not hate speech, that's not fighting hate speech or anti-Semitism. That is a clear political point of view. And while the ADL identifies itself as the world's leading anti-hate organization and a global leader in exposing extremism, it is extreme in and of itself. And I've been on the receiving end. When I was a host on KNBR in San Francisco in the 90s, and I had Pete McCloskey, the former Republican congressman, on my show, and we criticized Israeli policy, I was assigned a personal minder by the San Francisco ADL office. And they colluded with my management, and every time I talked about Israel, they would call up my boss and say, "He's at it again. Can't you shut him up?" Well, they didn't until they fired me. And so I welcome this critical examination of the work of the ADL, and I'm going to pursue this group, Drop the ADL, and see if I can get them here on the podcast for an interview. And finally today, I want to congratulate Frances Choi. 17 years ago, at the age of 17, she was arrested, charged, and after 2 mistrials, convicted of burning down her house and killing her parents. Well, it turns out the real perpetrator was the 16-year-old grandson of her father. So I take it he had had a previous marriage or relationship, and that he had children of various ages. But Kenneth, who left notes about how to burn down the house, he fled to Hong Kong before the 3rd trial where Frances was convicted. Well, the judge in the case has discovered racist emails and other exchanges between members of the prosecution team. And that was part of the reason that she freed Francis Choi from prison in April. And this week, Francis was officially exonerated and freed after 17 years in detention. And let's credit John Barter and Sharon Beckman at the Boston College Innocence Program for their dedicated efforts in proving her innocence and winning her freedom and full exoneration. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube if you look. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.